What's good, guys? So I just wanted to talk about the Stellar Blade demo now that I've had a chance to beat it. Before we get started, if you enjoy this content, a like would be super appreciated and consider subscribing. Anyways, first off, I kind of wanted to start with the narrative. I know a lot of people are talking about the gameplay, and we'll get to that, but I do want to say I had some reservations about this game before playing it, that games that are from Eastern studios that sort of adopt this sort of art style, and this is a Korean studio, which is odd because my favorite game of last year was Liza P, which was also from like a new Korean studio. So I'm starting to wonder if that's going to be a thing for me going forward, where these Korean studios are just going to pop up out of nowhere and give me products that I enjoy. But anyways, I digress. I feel like in a lot of these Eastern developed games, what you'll get, particularly ones that use this general art style, is you'll get characters who have emotions or deliveries that don't match the emotions of the narrative, where you get, you know, everything's kind of going south, and then they'll introduce like a very youthful, overly cheerful, sort of chirpy female character that, you know, doesn't necessarily match the emotions of the situation that they're in, or else they'll have a male character that's, you know, got sort of over the top dialogue and very bombastic delivery. I think that's probably done for comedic effect, but it pulls you emotionally out of the narrative, and that wasn't done here. Now, granted, that could be done, you know, in the full game, but at least so far, I feel like all of the characters were introduced in ways that I felt were consistent with the situation that they were in, which I appreciated, because that helps, I think, with the immersion of the narrative. Like, there's a lot of criticisms of Eve as being bland, but truthfully, if you look at the situation she's in, she starts off in what's essentially a counter invasion of Earth that goes wrong and leaves her in a very vulnerable state. And then she loses a close friend and teammate, partially because she's in that vulnerable state. Although I think even if she was at full health, the enemy that finally takes down Taki would have probably taken down her as well, even if they both were healthy. But you can't really know that, but it's sort of just the way they introduced that enemy. It sort of seemed like it was well above anything they could handle at that moment, particularly after fighting an enemy that was also, you know, pretty strong in and of itself. But I like that thus far, Eve's emotions, you know, she starts off going through a tragedy, and then she's 24 hours later in the story, she seems very somber and reflective. And given that really that's the whole section of the, you know, demo that we had to experience, I don't really know what sort of character development you would want from a demo that would flush her out more. I feel like everything that she did emotionally and how she was dealing with it was how you would expect somebody in that situation to process that. So I really felt like, you know, narratively, they didn't fall into a lot of the pit holes that a lot of Eastern developers tend to fall into with these types of stories. And then I think the other thing that I enjoyed about this, because, you know, a lot of people have labeled this game as a Souls-like, and I'm not sure that I 100% agree with the Souls-like comparison, which I'll get to in a moment, but I feel as if there was a lot of set-piece moments, both in the cinematics as well as in the gameplay, that I felt, you know, really helped with the pacing. Now, obviously, like, you start off with a counter invasion of Earth, and like everything is going, there's chaos all around you. So obviously I don't expect the pace of those set pieces to carry through the whole story of the game. But I like that you have those moments of action that kind of break up the, you know, the combat a little bit in the story. So that, you know, I feel like all of that was a positive. I wasn't really expecting a whole lot of that. I think the other thing, really presentation wise, is the soundtrack. The soundtrack to this game is absolute fire, and emotionally it really helps sell the moment to moment of this game. And this is a soundtrack that I could see, you know, me playing in the gym while I work out. Like, it felt that good. So, you know, moving on from that, let's get into the combat. The combat does not feel it's Souls-like adjacent, but it's not Souls-like, if that makes any sense. Like, there's no stamina system. It doesn't have a lot of the common tropes of a Souls-like game. Like, you don't lose all of your resources if you die. Yes, there are areas that you could call quote unquote bonfires, but the game autosaves, you know, as you go on. So those bonfires really don't do what they would do in a Souls game. They're more just areas where you can upgrade your character and, you know, sort of rest and move on. Like, yeah, they accomplish some of the things that a bonfire does, but they don't mean what a bonfire means in a Souls-like game. And I think that's an important distinction. The lack of the stamina system. Now, yeah, there is the timed deflection, time dodging. That's part of the combat. Where I feel like this game's DNA shares a lot more with a game like Sekiro than it does necessarily with a traditional Souls-like game, because there's no stamina, and the deflections are definitely necessary. But I also felt like, how do I put this? Yes, the deflections are necessary, but like if you get into the second boss fight, and I think the second boss fight was included because the way that you have to combat that second boss is far different than anything else in the entirety of the demo, is that you really need to focus on using your beta abilities to get chunks of the enemy's health down. If you literally just try to deflect the entire boss, like, you're gonna have to be perfect for a long time because you're really not doing a ton of damage, you know, with the execution type moves that you get off of the deflections. They do some damage, but you would have to probably break its balance, I would say, close to half a dozen times to chunk it down enough to where you could do it without using the beta moves. So as far as the combat goes, the beta moves feel like they are going to be a very large part of how you engage in the combat, but that really can't be reflected in the very beginning of the game because things are so simple and you don't really have all of the tools. You get those tools very relatively quickly, but you know, I think they wanted to show you sort of a cross-section of what it's going to feel like combat-wise later in the game. The other thing I think that I found interesting is the combat has, you know, it has a very action feel to it. A lot of the animations are very animated, for lack of a better term. I know that seems sort of like a redundant term, but they go out of their way to make a lot of the counters and a lot of the things that you do in battle feel very action oriented. And it's interesting because, like, if you look at a game like Sekiro, yeah, the action was very intense in that game and the combat. But if you look at the exploration and everything else there, like, the speed of the game felt very consistent throughout. Whereas opposed to this game, you don't necessarily move or explore the world very quickly. So when you get to those moments of combat, they feel very juxtaposed with the rest of the game. Like, it feels very, you know, the exploration feels very slow and deliberate. And then you have combat that it feels very chaotic, and it gives it almost more of a visceral feel just because it's those moments of chaos are not consistent, or those moments of speed are not consistent throughout the experience. And I guess there might be some people who have a problem with it, but I thought it was really interesting just how that made me feel emotionally and how I responded to the combat because of that juxtaposition. Anyways, I'm excited for the game. I'm far more excited for the game than I was before this demo. I'm glad that a lot of my reservations that I had about the game didn't end up at least holding true in what we got in the demo. And I guess we do, before we get off here, have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the controversy surrounding Eve, particularly, you know, on places like Twitter. And if you're not familiar, the controversy basically stems from a while back. Somebody had a post go viral where they said Eve is very childlike, and they kind of tried to label her as pedo bait. She's sexualized pedo bait. And I'm not going to sit here and say that she does not have youthful features, but I just don't understand why this is the particular example that you highlight, considering there's really large swaths of Eastern media that you could level this accusation at. It's very common to portray women in this way in the East. And so I kind of wonder why this is happening now when it could have been happening, hundreds of times over the past, 40 plus years. Granted, obviously, social media hasn't existed for 40 plus years, so that does factor into it. But a lot of it, I think, is just because it juxtaposes really differently with where Western games are right now. And a lot of these people who are, mainstream gaming journalists or mainstream gaming journalist adjacent, part of what I don't think people realize about it is they label everything as like either woke or anti-woke, but what they don't realize is it's all one vicious cycle. These mainstream gaming journalist sites, they basically survive off of rage clicks anymore. Like they really are looking to get a rise out of an audience. If it was just if these opinions were just made to appeal to the few people that agree with them, they wouldn't have an audience large enough to warrant really even having a job or really even having these IGNs and Kotakus of the world even be open. So like if you feel like raging at them, by all means rage at them, but understand in doing so you are the one granting them relevance. And there's a lot of people too that are adjacent to that who will sort of latch onto that because it is the mainstream, and the mainstream does control access to these developers and things of that nature. So a lot of these people, they may not necessarily go over the top with like you do with the IGNs and Kotakus because they're not necessarily rage clicking, but they'll have opinions that are a stone's throw away from those people without trying to elicit an emotion, just because they don't want to disagree with those folks, because they want to be viewed with legitimacy and they want to be able to have access to developers and things of that nature. So it's all just one vicious cycle, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't certain people who don't feel that way about her. I'm sure there are people who feel that way about her, but you have to realize that you can't really separate people's true feelings from the fact that a lot of, the IGNs and Kotakus of the world, they survive off of rage. Like they wouldn't exist without rage. So you can't separate their genuine opinion from the fact that they need that rage to survive. Anyways, that's it for sort of my view on this game. I'm excited. I did go ahead and pre-order the game because I thought the demo was a good enough experience to justify investing in it. And, I'm excited to try out the full game. I would never buy a game that I feel like is bad just because it makes somebody that I don't necessarily agree with upset. I think that's a ridiculous thing to do. And, but in this case, I feel like the game did enough positive to sell me on the possibility of it being good. So, demos are made to sell units, and that's what it did in this case. Anyways, if you have access to it, it's free to try. If you have PS5, it's a free demo, and I would encourage everybody to give it a shot and see what you think. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one, guys. And until next time, get awesome.